In the most exclusive restaurant in New York, a millionaire woman dropped $100,000 onto the table and laughed at the waiter standing before her. "If you can serve me in Chinese, this money is yours." In front of elite guests and international investors, that single father became nothing but entertainment, judged entirely by his cheap uniform and tired eyes. No one in that room knew what lay buried beneath his exhausted face. No one suspected the ability he carried, one powerful enough to turn everything upside down. Had she just picked the wrong target? The small apartment sat on the third floor of a Brooklyn walk-up, cramped but clean. Daniel Carter stood at the kitchen counter, slicing a tomato for the sandwiches he was making. He was 38 years old, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. His hands moved with quiet efficiency, the hands of a man who had learned to do everything alone. On the wall behind him hung a yellowed certificate in a dusty frame. The words, too, faded to read from a distance. Next to it was a photograph of three people: Daniel, a little boy, and a woman with dark hair and a bright smile. The woman was no longer alive. Ethan sat at the small table, swinging his legs as he watched his father work. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with the same serious eyes as Daniel. A bottle of prescription medication sat on the counter near the sink, a quiet reminder of the monthly checkups, the hospital bills, the insurance forms that never seemed to end. Daniel glanced at his son and forced a smile. "Dinner's almost ready, buddy." Ethan nodded, but his eyes drifted to the window. "Dad, when are we going to the zoo? You promised." Daniel felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. He had promised. 3 weeks ago. He set the plate in front of Ethan and sat down across from him. "This weekend," Daniel said. "I promise. Saturday morning, first thing." Ethan's face lit up, and for a moment, Daniel forgot about the exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. He had worked the delivery route since 6 in the morning, and in 2 hours, he would start his night shift at the restaurant. But looking at his son smile, none of that mattered. "You mean it?" Ethan asked. Daniel reached across the table and ruffled his hair. "I mean it." At 5:45, Daniel made a phone call. His mother-in-law answered on the second ring. "He's had dinner," Daniel said, keeping his voice low so Ethan wouldn't hear. "His medication is on the counter. He needs to be in bed by 8:30. The woman on the other end assured him she would be there in 15 minutes. Daniel thanked her and hung up. Before he left, he knelt beside Ethan and kissed his forehead. "Be good for Grandma, okay?" Ethan wrapped his arms around Daniel's neck. "Come home soon, Dad." Daniel held him for a moment longer than necessary. "I will." The Summit was one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan, the kind of place where a single meal could cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the tables were draped in white linen that seemed to glow under the soft lighting. Daniel entered through the service door at the back and made his way to the employee locker room. He changed into his uniform, black vest, white shirt, black tie, and checked his reflection in the small mirror on the inside of his locker door. He looked tired. He always looked tired now. Marco appeared beside him, already dressed and grinning. He was 24, full of energy, and one of the few people at the restaurant who treated Daniel like a human being rather than a ghost. "Big night tonight," Marco said, nudging Daniel with his elbow. "You hear about the VIP party?" Daniel shook his head as he adjusted his tie. Marco leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Victoria Ashford, the real estate billionaire. She's hosting some international investors, trying to close a deal worth $50 million. Henderson's been running around like his head's on fire." Daniel nodded, though the name meant nothing to him. Rich people were all the same to him now. They came, they ate, they left. He just had to stay invisible. Mr. Henderson appeared in the doorway, his face tight with stress. He was the restaurant manager, a man in his 50s who ran the floor with military precision.
Take it.
"Everyone listen up," he said. his voice cutting through the chatter. "Tonight is not the night for mistakes. Mrs. Ashford is one of our most important clients. Her table gets perfect service. No spills, no delays, no attitude. If anyone embarrasses this restaurant, they're gone. Understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Henderson's eyes swept over the staff, lingering on Daniel for a moment, before moving on. "Carter, you're on the VIP table tonight." Daniel felt his stomach tighten, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." At 7:15, Victoria Ashford arrived. She walked through the front entrance like she owned the building, and for all Daniel knew, maybe she did. She was 45 years old, dressed in a black designer gown, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharpness of her cheekbones. Her eyes scanned the room with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Behind her came 4 people, her international partners, the ones Marco had mentioned. Daniel watched them from the corner of his eye as he prepared the table. The first was Raymond Wells, an American investor in his 60s, with silver hair and a calm, observant demeanor. He had built his fortune in manufacturing and was known for his connections in the Chinese market. The second was Eleanor Pierce, a French-American woman in her 50s, elegant and reserved, who ran a luxury goods company based in Paris. The third was James Hartley, a businessman in his 40s, who had spent 20 years building trade relationships between American companies and Japanese corporations. The last was Marcus Webb, a quiet man with sharp eyes who had made his money in energy investments across the Middle East. These were people who measured others not by their words, but by their actions. Victoria led them to the VIP table, where Daniel stood waiting. She barely glanced at him as she took her seat, waving her hand dismissively. "Water for everyone. Sparkling for me." Daniel nodded and moved to fulfill the request. His legs ached from the delivery route, and his hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. As he poured the sparkling water into Victoria's glass, a few drops splashed onto the white tablecloth. It was barely noticeable, a tiny stain on the pristine fabric. But Victoria noticed. Her eyes locked onto the spot, and her lips curled into a smile that held no warmth. "Excuse me." Her voice was loud enough to carry across the nearby tables. Daniel froze, the water pitcher still in his hand. "Did you just spill water on my table?" Daniel lowered his head. "I apologize, ma'am. I'll replace the cloth immediately." But Victoria wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair, looking at him the way someone might look at an insect. "This is what passes for service in America? Clumsy, incompetent, pathetic." The words hit Daniel like stones, but he kept his face blank. He had learned long ago how to swallow humiliation. Behind him, he could feel the eyes of the other guests watching. Victoria turned to Raymond Wells, shaking her head in exaggerated disappointment. "This is exactly what I was telling you, Raymond. The quality of workers in this country has collapsed. No skills, no education, no ambition. Just people like this, stumbling through life." Raymond Wells said nothing, but his eyes moved to Daniel, studying him with quiet interest. Victoria seemed to feed on the silence. She turned back to Daniel, her smile widening. "Tell me, do you speak any Chinese?" "No, of course not. People like you couldn't possibly learn a language like that. It requires intelligence." Then she did something that made the entire table go still. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick stack of cash, $100 bills bound together with a gold clip. She dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud. $100,000, she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "If you can serve this table in proper Mandarin Chinese, introduce the menu, explain the dishes, answer our questions, this money is yours. Right here, right now, in front of everyone." She laughed, looking around at her partners, as if inviting them to share the joke. "What do you say?" The table was silent. Eleanor Pierce shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her expression troubled. James Hartley set down his chopsticks and watched with a serious face. Marcus Webb crossed his arms, his eyes moving between Victoria and Daniel. And Raymond Wells. He simply waited, his gaze fixed on Daniel with something that looked almost like curiosity. In the corner of the room, Marco watched with wide eyes, his hand gripping the back of a chair. Mr. Henderson stood near the kitchen entrance, his jaw tight, ready to intervene. Daniel stood motionless, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. In his mind, he saw Ethan's face, the boy waiting at home, the medical bills on the counter, the promise of the zoo on Saturday. He could walk away. He could bow his head and disappear into the kitchen, keep his job, keep his dignity buried where it had been for 3 years. That was the safe choice. That was what he had always done. But then he heard Victoria whisper to Eleanor Pierce, her voice just loud enough for him to catch. "Look at him. He's already scared. People like him were born to serve, not to be respected." Something shifted inside Daniel. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was something older, something deeper. A voice from the past, soft and warm, echoing in his memory. His wife's voice from a night long ago, when she had looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "I love you not because of what you know, but because you never let anyone define who you are." Daniel raised his head. He looked directly at Victoria Ashford, and for the first time that night, he did not look tired. He looked calm. "I accept," he said. Victoria Ashford's smile faltered for just a moment. She had not expected him to accept. The game was supposed to end with his humiliation. A bowed head, a mumbled apology, a shuffling retreat to the kitchen. That was how it always worked with people like him. But the waiter stood there, his eyes steady, his voice clear, and for the first time that evening, Victoria felt something she did not like. Uncertainty. She recovered quickly, her smile sharpening into something more dangerous. Well, the servant has courage after all." She leaned forward, resting her chin on her manicured fingers. "But I think we need to make this more interesting." The table grew quieter. Raymond Wells watched without expression, his hands folded on the white tablecloth. Eleanor Pierce glanced at Victoria with a flicker of disapproval, but said nothing. James Hartley set his water glass down slowly, his attention now fully on the scene unfolding before him. Marcus Webb uncrossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes moving between Victoria and Daniel like a man calculating odds. In the corner of the room, Marco stood frozen, his knuckles white against the back of a chair. Mr. Henderson had taken a step forward from his position near the kitchen, his face tight with tension. Victoria gestured lazily at the leather-bound menu resting on the table. "I've changed my mind. A few phrases won't do. Anyone can memorize a greeting. If you want this money, you'll present the entire menu in Mandarin Chinese. Every dish, every ingredient, every cooking method. And if there's a regional origin, Sichuan, Cantonese, Fujian, you'll explain that too." She tilted her head, savoring the moment. Like a real expert. Like someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Her partners shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. Victoria was not finished. She held up one finger, her nail gleaming red under the chandelier light. "And here's the new condition. If you fail, if you stumble, if you mispronounce a single word, if you can't answer a question, you will kneel right here in front of everyone and apologize to me. You will admit that you're a liar, a fraud, someone who tried to pretend he was more than he is." Her voice dropped to a near whisper, intimate and cruel. "Do we have a deal?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against him. His heart beat slowly, steadily, as if it belonged to someone else. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was not a nervous smile or a defeated one. It was the smile of a man who had just seen the entire game laid out before him and found it smaller than he expected. "I accept your conditions," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the table. "But I have a condition of my own." Victoria's eyes narrowed. This was not part of the script. "Excuse me?" Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "If I present the menu not only in standard Mandarin, but also in Cantonese and Minnan dialect, with accurate cultural and regional explanations for each, you will double the money. $200,000. A ripple of surprise passed through the table. Raymond Wells raised an eyebrow, the first visible reaction he had shown all evening. Eleanor Pierce exchanged a glance with James Hartley. Marcus Webb's lips curved into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Victoria stared at Daniel as if he had just spoken in a language she could not understand. Then she laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "You're out of your mind." She looked around at her partners, expecting them to share her amusement, but their faces remained serious. She turned back to Daniel, her smile hardening. "Fine, $200,000. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll kneel and apologize twice as long. Deal?" Daniel nodded once. "Deal." The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. What had begun as casual cruelty had transformed into something else. A confrontation, a test, a battle of wills. Other diners at nearby tables had stopped their conversations, their attention drawn to the VIP section. "Mister?" Henderson stood rigidly by the kitchen door, torn between intervening and letting the scene play out. From inside the kitchen, Chef Laurent emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. He had heard everything through the service window. His eyes found Daniel, and he gave a small nod. Not of encouragement exactly, but of acknowledgement. He wanted to see what would happen next. Daniel picked up the menu from the table. The leather was smooth and heavy in his hands. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the elegant calligraphy of the dish names printed in English and Chinese. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. A memory was surfacing, unbidden, from a place he had tried to bury for 3 years. The last time he had stood before an audience like this, it had been at an international conference in Singapore. He had been the keynote interpreter, flawless in 9 languages, praised by everyone in the room. And in the front row, watching him with pride shining in her eyes, had been his wife. That was the last time she ever saw him work. 3 months later, she was gone. The memory cut through him like a blade. He remembered the phone call from the hospital, the words that made no sense. Accident, critical condition. We did everything we could. He remembered arriving too late. He remembered holding her hand when it was already cold. After that, everything collapsed. He stopped working. He stopped speaking. He stopped being the man he had been. The only thing that kept him alive was Ethan, the boy who needed him, the boy who didn't understand why Mommy wasn't coming home. Daniel had packed away his certificates, his awards, his languages. He had buried that version of himself and become invisible. A delivery driver, a waiter, a ghost. Now, standing in this restaurant with $200,000 on the table and a room full of strangers watching, Daniel felt the old fear rising in his chest. The voice in his head whispered the same words it had whispered for 3 years. "You're not that man anymore. You're nothing. Just walk away." His grip on the menu tightened. For a moment, he considered it. He could set the menu down, apologize, and disappear into the kitchen. He could go home to Ethan and forget this ever happened. That was the safe path. That was the path he had chosen 1,000 times before. Then he heard Victoria's voice, low and mocking, as she leaned toward Eleanor Pierce. "Look at him. He's already shaking. I told you, people like him are born to serve. They don't have the capacity to be anything more." The words cut through the fog of memory. Daniel's jaw tightened. He thought of Ethan, sitting at the kitchen table that afternoon, looking up at him with those serious eyes. "Dad, are you good at anything?" And Daniel had answered, without thinking, "I'll show you someday." He raised his head. His hand stopped trembling. When he looked at Victoria, his eyes were no longer tired. They were clear. Daniel opened his mouth and began to speak in Mandarin Chinese. The words flowed from him like water from a spring, fluid, precise, and unmistakably authentic. His accent was perfect Beijing standard, the kind learned not from textbooks, but from years of immersion. Zunjing de Gewei Guibun, Jinwan wo Jiang Wei Ninjia Shao Woman de Tese Kaidan. Honored guests, tonight I will introduce our special menu. The effect was immediate. Raymond Wells's eyes widened. He leaned forward in his seat, his calm composure finally cracking. Victoria's smile vanished, replaced by something closer to shock. Daniel continued without hesitation, moving through the appetizer section with the confidence of a scholar. He named each dish in Mandarin, then explained its origins, which province it came from, which dynasty had perfected the recipe, which ingredients gave it its distinctive flavor. When he reached the dim sum selection, he shifted seamlessly into Cantonese, his tones rising and falling with the musical cadence of the southern dialect. Nandu dim sam hai, yung chuntung, guangzhou saoyai jingge. This dim sum is made using traditional Guangzhou techniques. Raymond Wells, who had spent decades doing business in Hong Kong, nearly rose from his chair. His face showed something Daniel had not seen from anyone in years: genuine respect. Victoria sat frozen, her mouth slightly open. She looked around the table, searching for someone to share her disbelief, but her partners were no longer paying attention to her. They were watching Daniel. When he reached the seafood section, Daniel transitioned into Minnan dialect, the language of Fujian province and Taiwan, explaining how generations of fishermen had developed these recipes along the southern coast. His pronunciation was flawless, his knowledge deep. This was not a waiter reciting memorized phrases. This was an expert delivering a lecture. But Daniel was not finished. He turned to Eleanor Pierce, switching languages as easily as changing channels. "Madame, si vous le permettez, je peux également expliquer les techniques culinaires françaises utilisées dans ce plat. La réduction du vin, l'émulsion du beurre, la précision de la cuisson." Eleanor's hand flew to her chest. Her French was native, and even she could not find a flaw in his accent. She let out a small laugh of pure astonishment and nodded with undisguised admiration. "Extraordinaire," she whispered. Daniel turned to James Hartley, shifting into Japanese. "Hartley-san, kono ryori wa nihon no kaiseki ryori kara inspiration wo ukete imasu. Kisetsu no sozai wo ikashita dento tekina choriho desu." Hartley, who had spent his career bridging American and Japanese business cultures, stared at Daniel as if seeing him for the first time. His expression softened into something close to wonder. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that needed no translation. Finally, Daniel addressed Marcus Webb in Arabic. "Sayyid, hadha al-tabaq, yajma'u bayn al-nakhat al-sharqiyya wa al-gharbiyya, bitaroka mutanagima." Sir, this dish combines Eastern and Western flavors in a harmonious way. Marcus Webb, a man who had spent decades building relationships across the Middle East, placed his right hand over his heart, the traditional gesture of respect in Arab culture. His eyes held a warmth that had not been there before. One by one, Daniel had spoken to each of them in their own language, or the language of their deepest professional connections. 9 languages. Perfect fluency. Not a single hesitation. Not a single error. The room was utterly silent. Every diner, every server, every person in the summit had stopped to watch. And at the center of it all, Victoria Ashford sat with her face pale and her hands gripping the edge of the table. The stack of money in front of her seemed to mock her now. "Enough," Victoria's voice cracked as she cut through the silence. Her composure had shattered completely. She looked at Daniel with something between fury and fear. "Who are you? How is this possible?" Daniel closed the menu calmly and set it back on the table. He looked at her, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a quietness that was somehow more devastating than either. "I'm your server tonight, ma'am, just as you said." The words landed like a verdict. Victoria's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Around her, her partners exchanged glances, not with her, but with each other. And in those glances was a message that Victoria was only beginning to understand. Everything had changed. Raymond Wells rose slowly from his chair. The movement was deliberate, commanding attention without demanding it. He walked around the table toward Daniel, his silver hair catching the light from the chandeliers above. The other guests watched in silence as the older man stopped directly in front of the waiter. Wells studied Daniel's face for a long moment, his eyes searching for something. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the room. "Daniel Carter, from the Singapore conference, 3 years ago." It was not a question. Daniel met his gaze and nodded once. "Yes, sir." Wells turned to face the table, his expression grave. "I thought I recognized something when he started speaking. The voice, the precision, the way he shifts between dialects without a single hesitation." He looked at Victoria, then at the other partners, making sure each of them understood the weight of what he was about to say. "This man standing before you was one of the most sought-after linguistic experts and interpreters in the world. He worked for the United Nations. He translated at international summits, where a single misunderstood word could have started a war. He consulted for multinational corporations, negotiating billion-dollar deals across 6 continents. Eleanor Pierce drew in a sharp breath. James Hartley leaned forward, his eyes wide. Marcus Webb nodded slowly, as if a puzzle he had been working on had finally revealed its solution. Wells continued, his voice steady. "Daniel Carter speaks 9 languages fluently: English, Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese, Minnan dialect, French, Japanese, Arabic, Spanish, Russian. I attended a conference in Beijing years ago where he provided simultaneous interpretation for delegates from 7 countries. His work was so flawless that half the room thought he was a native speaker of their own language." He turned back to Daniel. "I never forgot that." Victoria's face had turned the color of old paper. She gripped the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "That's impossible," she whispered. "He's a waiter. He's nobody." But even as she spoke, her voice lacked conviction. The evidence was standing right in front of her. Raymond Wells ignored her protest and addressed Daniel directly. "What happened? Why did you leave?" The question hung in the air. Daniel felt a heaviness press against his ribs. The weight he had carried for 3 years. The weight he had never spoken about to anyone outside his family. But something had shifted inside him tonight. The wall he had built around himself had cracked, and the words came out before he could stop them. 3 years ago, my wife was killed in a car accident." Daniel's voice was steady, but there was a roughness beneath the surface that betrayed the cost of each word. "We had a son, Ethan. He was 5 years old. After she died, he started having health problems, anxiety, night terrors, issues that required constant monitoring and regular hospital visits. I couldn't fly to Geneva one week and Tokyo the next, while my boy was falling apart at home." He took a breath. "So I stopped. I left the conferences, the contracts, the career. I took whatever work I could find that let me stay close to him. Delivery routes during the day, this job at night. Whatever it took to pay the bills and be there when he needed me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the other diners in the restaurant seemed to hold their breath. Daniel looked at Victoria, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet, unshakable dignity. I'm not ashamed of this job. Every dollar I earn is honest. Every hour I work means something, because it keeps my son fed and safe. That's more important than any title or any salary. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She looked around the table, searching for an ally, and found none. Raymond Wells turned to face her fully, his voice cold. Mrs. Ashford, tonight you publicly humiliated a man who has more ability and more integrity than most people in this room, including yourself. He let the words sink in before continuing. You tried to turn him into entertainment. You mocked him for wearing a uniform, for working an honest job, for not meeting your standards of success. And in doing so, you showed everyone here exactly who you are. Victoria's lips trembled. Raymond, the deal. Wells cut her off with a raised hand. There is no deal. I will not do business with someone who treats other human beings this way. Not today. Not ever. Eleanor Pierce spoke next, her French-accented voice soft but firm. I agree with Raymond. The way you behaved tonight was disgraceful. My company values integrity above profit. I cannot in good conscience continue this partnership. James Hartley nodded, his expression serious. In Japan, we have a saying, a person's true character is revealed by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. You have revealed yours, Mrs. Ashford. Marcus Webb uncrossed his arms and looked at Victoria with undisguised contempt. Where I come from, we judge a person by how they treat those who serve them. You failed that test completely. Victoria's face crumbled. In the span of a few minutes, her $50 million deal had collapsed. The partners she had spent months cultivating had turned their backs on her. And the waiter she had tried to destroy stood before her, unbowed and unbroken. With shaking hands, she reached for the stack of money on the table, the $200,000 she had so confidently wagered. She pushed it across the tablecloth toward Daniel, unable to meet his eyes. There was no apology in the gesture, no grace, only the bitter acknowledgement of defeat. Raymond Wells reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card. He held it out to Daniel. Mr. Carter, my company has an international relations division that desperately needs someone with your skills. The position is flexible. You can work remotely or from our New York office, whatever suits your situation. You'll have time for your son. Daniel looked at the card for a long moment before accepting it. He did not answer immediately, but he slipped it into his pocket with a small nod. Eleanor Pierce rose from her chair and approached him. My company may also require translation services in the future. Please consider us as well. She pressed her own card into his hand. You have my direct line. Daniel thanked them both quietly, then stepped back from the table. The show was over. He picked up the stack of money, $200,000, more than he had earned in the past 3 years combined, and turned toward the kitchen. As he walked away, he felt the eyes of the entire restaurant following him, but he did not look back. In the employee locker room, Daniel changed out of his uniform in silence. His hands moved mechanically, folding the vest, hanging up the white shirt. Marco burst through the door a moment later, his face lit up with excitement. Man, I've worked with you for 2 years, and I had no idea who you were. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. You're a legend. Daniel smiled faintly as he buttoned his jacket. I'm just a father, trying to take care of his kid. That's all. Marco shook his head in disbelief, but said nothing more. Mr. Henderson appeared in the doorway. The manager looked at Daniel for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he extended his hand. You always have a place here, Carter. But I think you deserve better than this. Daniel shook his hand firmly. Thank you, sir. For everything. Henderson nodded once and stepped aside. As Daniel walked toward the exit, he passed the kitchen. Chef Laurent stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him. The French chef said nothing, but he gave Daniel a slow, respectful nod, the kind one professional gives to another. Daniel returned it and kept walking. The apartment was dark when Daniel arrived home. His mother-in-law had left a note on the kitchen counter. Ethan fell asleep at 8:30. He ate all his dinner. "Call me tomorrow." Daniel set the note aside and walked quietly to his son's bedroom. Ethan lay curled under his blanket, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and watched him sleep. In his pocket, he could feel the weight of Raymond Wells's business card. He took it out and looked at it in the dim light from the hallway. Then his eyes drifted to the photograph on Ethan's nightstand, the same photograph that hung in the living room. 3 faces, a family that no longer existed. Daniel looked at his wife smile, frozen forever in that moment of happiness. He whispered into the darkness, "I didn't let anyone define who I am. You were right." He stayed there for a long time, watching his son breathe, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 years. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Daniel made breakfast. Ethan stumbled out of his room, rubbing his eyes. "Dad, are we still going to the zoo on Saturday?" Daniel turned from the stove, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his smile reached his eyes. "We're going, and I have a story to tell you on the way." Ethan climbed into his chair, curious. What kind of story? Daniel set a plate of eggs in front of his son and sat down across from him. A story about how the things that make us who we are never really disappear. They just wait for the right moment to come back. Outside the window, the morning sun continued to rise over Brooklyn, promising a new day. Knowledge and dignity are never truly lost. They are only hidden for a time, waiting for the right moment to shine again.